I was asked to speak a bit about the work that we have been doing at United Methodist Communications for the last couple of years, and to speak in more specific terms about how we as religious communicators see ourselves and function within the organizations or institutions that we are currently working in. I'm assuming most of us are connected in some way to a religious organization or institution or denomination or faith group. Is that a fair assumption to have? And so we are in many ways expressions or the voices for those organizations. About 4 years ago, the United Methodist Church began a process, and I'm going to speak a bit out of my own faith tradition, recognizing that much of what I say is not so much about any kind of sectarian content as it is about organizational and communications strategies that we are, I think, all commonly involved in these days. The church, as it is wont to do from time to time, in attempting to address some of its problems, thought that the best way we could address those was to restructure. And it seems in our denomination that when we struggle with difficult questions, one of the ways that we can deal with those questions by avoiding them is to restructure, because that's a comfortable way to deal with them. But the challenge that presented to us at United Methodist Communications was to establish the importance of a communications function in the church as a strategic value and not as a support value. And one of the concerns that I have about us as communicators in a religious context is that too frequently our organizations and those to whom we answer view the role of a communicator or of communications in a fundamentally back office sort of way. That is to say, we are support functions, we are technical people, we know how to turn on the projectors, we know how to do the applications that run the PowerPoint, or we know how to make the slides, but that understanding of our function does not rise to the level of thinking strategically about how the organization should be communicating with those with whom it wishes to have a conversation today. And so I began to speak and write about this. And I also began to reflect on how that process of doing strategic communication has changed over the years. And so I want to share with you just a brief story. Some of you in the room are too young to even have been alive at the time of this story, but it's important for us to know because it's a part of our heritage as communicators. On March the 26th, 1949, President Harry Truman, at the request of Bishop Henry Knox Sherrill of the Episcopal Church in the United States, mounted a microphone in the United States to ask the people of the United States to support the relief effort that was necessary following World War II in Asia and in Europe, where millions of people were displaced, were hungry, were without clothing, without shelter, without medical care, and moving about on both of those, in both of those areas with no connection to their former lives, because the European continent had been racked by war and much of Asia had been racked by war. And so Truman, in a national broadcast, asked the people of the United States to build a new world, a far better world, one in which the eternal dignity of all humanity is respected, and to do that by contributing to an offering that was called One Great Hour of Sharing. I don't know if those of you who are recent participants in that offering in the Protestant community realize that it springs from those roots many, many years ago and was an expression of those mainline communions about how they projected their voice into the culture globally at a critical time of great human need. For the next 40 years, the religious communions that initiated One Great Hour of Sharing utilized media relatively well and relatively effectively to affect public perception and to present faith values and project those values into the public discourse for the common good. But around 1980, due to financial constraints, due to political targeting from right-wing ideologues, and due to lack of foresight, those voices began to withdraw from the media. Unfortunately, this withdrawal occurred at the same time that broadcast media, especially television and radio, were becoming much more influential in shaping the culture. And the result was that those who carried cultural values, faith values, into the public discourse pulled out as the media themselves became more influential in shaping public culture. Religious entrepreneurs seized on the opportunities to buy radio and television station licenses, and they became the on-air presence and voice of religion for many people in the United States. So as all of this connects to what I want to share with you about our role as strategic communicators, but I wanted to share that history with you in order to sort of lay a foundation for where I think we need to be working as communicators today on behalf of faith communities. Why this happened is there are multiple reasons. One is finance. It was much more expensive to produce in broadcast, particularly after the FCC removed the requirement from stations to provide public service time free of charge, and religious communions could not sustain the production costs that were necessary under that FCC ruling. There was also a misreading of the communications environment. One of the things that we misread in today's environment, particularly those who run religious organizations, is the sense that once your message is out and once you are known, it is as if you are granted a deed to being perceived in the public. And the reality is there is no deed to public perception. As soon as your message is out, you're then competing with hundreds of other messages, and the awareness needs to be constantly reinforced, and your work needs to be constantly revitalized in order to maintain a public presence and public perception. And so we have to earn awareness on a daily basis, if not even more often, in this digital world in which we live. The other was a misunderstanding of the role of media, in that media not only reflect culture, but they shape culture. And we had the sense that it was sufficient in the 1980s, I think, as we withdrew from the media, to say that it's enough for us to critique culture, but not to make it by being participants in the media. There was also a misreading of communications, as I've said, that it's a support function. And because we were comfortable as communions in that environment, had established a presence, it was, I think, among the folks that I talked to, because I lived through this time and debated with many of my supervisors about it, that because we were present, we would always have that presence. And the result of all of this is that many of the mainline voices lost their voice and are no longer as present as they need to be or once were. So that's the history. Let me talk to you a little bit now about how I see the organizational challenges that we face and that I think we can address these, and there are ways to do that. The organizational change that occurred in this media environment is that we moved from a vertical organization to a horizontal society. And what I mean by that is new media have created a completely new communications environment. And we all know this. We just heard for the last hour and a half much about that new media environment. It's a horizontal environment, and folks are no longer waiting to hear from the person at the top of an organization to send a message through the executive staff and the district leaders and in the case of religious denominations that I'm a part of, the local church pastors and the officers of the church to the people in the pew. That's a vertical style of communicating, and it starts with a message at the top that the institution wishes to have distributed. Well, guess what? No one is waiting with anxious and bated breath to hear what the organization thinks that they want to hear. That in fact they can Google whatever they want to find, and they are also more interested in what the issues are that they are concerned with on a daily basis than whatever the institution desires for them to know. Jay Rosen, who is a professor of journalism at New York University, coined the phrase that I use frequently in conversations like this, and that is the people formerly known as the audience. And you all know those folks, don't you? Because aren't they responding to you in Twitter and on Facebook by creating their own content, by interpreting whatever your messages are in ways that serve their understandings, and in communicating those messages or rejecting those messages because they are empowered with new media to behave differently than a vertical organization assumes that they will behave. So that's the organizational challenge that we face, to begin to operate as a horizontal organization that is in this media environment functioning in a much different way than we have in the past. Let me tell you what I think that the mainline brings in this context to the public discourse. One of the first and the most important things that I think you bring to the public discourse as representative of interfaith organizations in this world today is a concern for the common good. The second is value making systems that are more just and inclusive. Religious entrepreneurs do not speak of the common good. Religious entrepreneurs speak about subscribing to their radio or television or other messages in order to sustain their operations. Religious entrepreneurs speak less about making value systems more just and inclusive than they speak about an individualized and privatized religion that does not consider justice nor the common good as core values. I think the other thing that we bring is the value of community over against two narratives that I'm becoming increasingly concerned about and want to do more writing about, and that is the religious narrative that makes faith private and inward. And there's a lot of this kind of narrative in our world today, and much of it has to do with being spiritual but not religious, which privatizes spirituality in an individual way. And I'm not at all saying that I don't agree that we ought to develop our faith individually and be formed and shaped by faith as individuals, but that is only one part of what Jesus, in my tradition, called us to do, which is to love God. But in another part of that same message said, and love each other. And so those two pieces, it seems to me, are a part of what much of our faith tradition and our interfaith practice can bring to the conversation. The other narrative of individualism that deeply concerns me is the narrative of corporate consumption. It's a narrative of corporations that is based upon providing us with self-gratification through consumption. And that narrative is a narrative that, in my tradition, is an unbiblical narrative. The idea that we as people are reduced to roles as consumers is an unbiblical idea. We are called to be stewards of the creation, to care for the creation, not to consume it, not to use it up. And so this narrative of corporate individualism is a message that I believe that mainline folks can address in a different way and challenge. So the mainline calls us to create a world in which the dignity of all humanity is respected, as President Truman said many, many years ago. So what I've said to our United Methodist colleagues as we began to talk about reorganization is that not only should the church engage the culture, this is fundamental to faithfulness in our religious tradition, but that we must also think strategically about how we do that and communicate strategically about how we do that. And if we do not, we become irrelevant to the culture because we are not heard and because someone else will tell our story for us. Now, we have this problem in our denomination more than I wish that we had, and that is that by our inability to engage the culture in direct and immediate ways, we often do not tell our story. And when we do not tell our story, there are others who will tell it for us, and they will shape the story according to how they perceive us, or even worse, I've begun to understand that not only will they tell our story, they will lay claim to the tradition based upon how they understand the tradition and represent themselves as the core in much of what we hear today of traditional United Methodism, which in fact is a very narrow view of the tradition that we hold. And so the silence of our mainline voice has not only done damage to the wider culture, it has done damage to our internal ability as a community as well. So I think this highlights the importance, I've said, of communication as a strategic function. Without an intentional communication strategy, we become invisible or worse. The marketing expert Stephen Yastrow, with whom we have worked, says your brand is not what you tell people you are. Your brand is what people tell others you are. You don't determine your brand. Your relationship to others who speak of you determine your brand. By this he means that the various ways that people experience us determine how they perceive us, and if they perceive us as being silent in the public discourse or absent from it altogether, their perception could easily be that we don't care, we are powerless, we are self-absorbed, or we are irrelevant. Strategic communication matters. So I'm going to quickly move through some notes so we can have some conversation as you continue your meal. The mainline offers concern for the common good. It offers inclusiveness. It offers care for creation, justice and equity. And most importantly, the organizations that we represent offer scope and scale to bring about positive change that we often underestimate. And I hope if I impress you with nothing else, that I impress you with the concern that your organization can bring to public discourse and to public change and social change scope and scale that is desperately needed to be expressed today. These values are transformative. They offer potential for healing, for reconciliation, and for renewal. And as our speaker said this morning, the need for that at least in Western culture, where politics is now broken, is manifest to us. The mainline, therefore, must reframe the narrative. And so I want to move now to another point, and I'll kind of wrap up what I want to say. We, in our part of the faith community, are entrapped in a narrative that has been used to describe us for a number of years, because we have not told our own story well and not been thinking strategically about how to communicate that, and we're trapped in a narrative of decline. And if you all are not trapped in that narrative, God bless you, I'm glad. But we in the narrative of our church have been for a number of years trapped in a narrative of decline that says that we are an aging faith community. We are dying faster than we're replacing new members. We're losing members faster than we're replacing members. And woe is me, that is a terrible situation to be in. In fact, the reality is we are growing faster than the church has grown since the 1800s. We are increasingly seeing that our members, however, are not being replaced in the U.S., which is an aging population, and in Europe, which is an aging population, but in the Philippines and in Africa, where the church is growing in exponential ways. And eventually, we will catch up to the reality that not only are we growing, but that we are growing younger as these new people in these areas begin to participate in the church. The other measurement is that our giving has never been greater in the United Methodist Church than it has been, because the boomers who have accumulated their wealth and who are the core of the church in the United States now have greater resources than they have ever had in their lives, and we are at the point of a generational transfer of wealth that is quite remarkable. And so in the middle of this narrative of decline, which we have allowed other folks to use to define us, here we are, a church that has more members than it's ever had in its history, giving more money than they've ever given in their history, growing younger as the days go. And we in the United States continue to repeat this narrative. So I've asked our leadership, our Council of Bishops and others, and I believe that they have heard and are moving to reframe the narrative by telling legitimate stories of vitality, by re-engaging with millennials around their concerns and not about what we are concerned. Because when you talk about the narrative of decline, it's very difficult for a person who's outside your faith community to get very interested in you. I mean, do you want to buy a ticket on the Titanic? You know, that's what we're asking millennials to do. And so we talk not so much about what we need as about what folks need who are in the culture, who are attempting to come to terms with what it means to be a person of faith. What is faithfulness today? How does that relate to my daily life and offer me a different way to understand myself in relationship to others and in relationship to the world? I think we also re-narrate the conversation in my faith understanding and in the understanding that I think we have as our faith community by emphasizing core values such as the graciousness of a loving God, the beauty of a creation with which we are entrusted and called to protect, with an inclusive and loving community, and with an inquisitive and open approach to faith. These values are in stark contrast to many of the values that are promoted in secular culture, in the corporate narrative, and among those who are the religious entrepreneurs who are in broadcast and radio. And I think that's what we have to contribute to the public conversation today. I think finally that we have a moment of opportunity. You just heard over the last hour and a half ways that we can communicate more broadly, less expensively, and more effectively through digital media. We are not dependent upon the old traditional media. The gatekeepers have really been made obsolete, and we really do have the ability to communicate our messages in conversations with people in new ways that are more direct and more useful. Let me close with this typology that I speak to our staff at UMCOM about, and to our board of directors and to our leaders. The traditional public relations focus of a vertical organization has been on a one-way process, and the contrast to that is a focus on strategic communications, which is a two-way relationship. We don't deliver messages today, we engage in conversations. The traditional way of viewing communication is that the organization's interests should be served. The strategic communications way of viewing this is that the organization and its publics are served. The traditional way of viewing communication is that it is spin, propaganda, and self-promotion. The strategic communication function that we carry out today is to engage in dialogue and in interaction. The traditional view of communication is that it is persuasion. The strategic view is that it is mutual understanding. There is much more for us to learn from being in conversation with each other than there is value in us attempting to persuade each other. The traditional view of communication carries with it an illusion that you can control the message. Today, the message cannot be controlled. Communication is, in fact, a shared process. The traditional view of the media is that there is an audience. The strategic view is that the audience is formerly known as the audience, and the audience is creating, sharing, and influencing perception, and the best and most effective way to engage them is to participate with them in the conversation. The traditional view of communication is that it is cognitive. It's about what you know, and it's tactical. It's about what you do. The strategic view is that it is behavioral and strategic. By strategy, I mean that we give thought before about how we wish to engage with people, what they need to hear from us based upon research that we know from having listened to them, and then packaging the messages that they say they need to hear from us in a way that is compatible with both our behavior as they experience us and their needs as they have expressed them to us. And finally, the traditional view of communication is that it is desirable to create short-term change in behavior. If you can just get through this crisis and change people's attitudes, we will have been a success. Well, no. The strategic view is that you want to build long-term relationships with them and with the organization. If we take our responsibility seriously, I think fundamentally what we do is build community, create a perception that we are all in this for the common good together, and that we have the opportunity to heal a broken world. That, I think, is the ultimate strategy that we need to be pursuing as communicators in an interfaith context. That in this broken world, we are the agents of communication that helps create healing. And when we do that, we live up to our faith values, regardless of which faith we claim and regardless of which faith community to which we relate. So that's what we have done in our work at United Methodist Communications as we attempted to deal with this whole effort at reorganization. There's a whole lot more that we've done, and I've written about that primarily because I wanted to get this on the agenda of our leadership so that we could begin to change the perception of communication as a support function and get it into a more strategic role. And now we are beginning to do that. And we've got our own problems in doing that. You all know from the news that we're dealing with a significant issue around human sexuality, and that's not yet resolved, and that will continue to be something that we struggle with. But the point, even in that I am making to our folks, is that we make that a transparent conversation, and that we seek to not engage in the discussions around the polarities of those things which divide us, but seek to find a common ground in the middle, which asks, where are we to be as people who believe in a loving God, who believe in the dignity and the sacredness of human personality, and who believe that we must treat each other as God treats us, and we must treat others as we wish to be treated. And in that conversation, we then begin to move away from the polarities of dogma and into a behavior that is a different behavior than the polarizing behavior that is so common in this world, and that is so easy to capture in stories about conflict using a journalistic model that is a model of polarities and reporting on polarities. That's a whole nother lecture. I won't get into that, but I'm going to stop with that. If you have questions, if you want to have some interaction, I'm certainly glad to do that. And I appreciate the opportunity to be here. I appreciate the attention that you're able to give me as you have your lunch. And welcome you to Nashville. And I'm really pleased that you're getting a chance to react with and interact with our United Methodist Communications staff in some of the ways that you are. So thank you.
You alluded very briefly, perhaps, to the nuns, but didn't really develop that whole. Perhaps you could develop that a little bit more. As you know, the people who really say I'm spiritual but not religious, the people who don't attach any particular religious tradition, I think they're often described as the fastest growing religious group in the United States right now. And so what would you say would be some specific ways that you could try to reach out to them and bring them back in?
Well, I think he's saying that the fastest growing group in terms of religious surveys these days are folks who identify themselves as the nuns, the N-O-N-E-S. And how might we reach out to them? I think within our tradition, and I'm speaking really out of that, what we are seeing is that we need to engage with people in the sorts of activities and experiences that they indicate they are interested in. We cannot go to them and say, would you come to our church, or would you participate in our worship service, or would you accept faith as we traditionally have asked them to accept it? And that is to make a confession of faith and then participate in the life of a communion or of a local church, and then grow and develop in the faith. That in fact you have to meet them where they are through contact, through social media, through other kinds of communication in the places where they are comfortable. You have to invite them to be engaged with you in activities in which they are comfortable, and that may very well be an activity to go to a foreign country and do some kind of rehabilitation of a facility, or it may be taking part in a run or in some other kind of activity that is their choice, and then relate to them long enough that they begin to see that this is an invitational community and a community to which they would want to be a part of. We used to say, if you look at religious commitment, you start at home plate and you get people committed, and then you move them to first base, and first base is to get them involved in worship. And then getting them involved in worship, you get them involved in study, and then getting them involved in study. You get them to third base where they make a confession of faith and they are baptized and they're back to home plate. What we're saying is, no, you start at third base with an experience that builds community, that affirms who they are, that invites them into a relationship. And we've done a tremendous amount of study on millennials and have been doing study on millennials and people we call seekers for a number of years. If you want to get on our website, you'll see the results of some of those studies. But they track with what Pew says about millennials, and they track with what other researchers, the Barna Group, says about millennials. And essentially it's getting involved with them at the experiential level and the relationship level as an entry point.
Any other questions?
I'll ask one. And Larry, this is not a contention. I want you to clarify some more stuff, because you gave us a litany of traditionally, traditionally spin, traditionally persuasion, traditionally short term. And I worked in the United Methodist environment. I think I know what you mean. But whose tradition? From whose perspective is it seen that way? Because part of my training is public relations scholarship for 30 years has been mutual benefit, two-way communication, symmetrical relationships, not transactions but interactions, all words you use. So whose tradition? Who's seeing it that way?
I think as I sit in meetings in the organizations, the groups that I work with in our denomination, very frequently, and I just came from one in Minneapolis just a couple of days ago. What we do is talk about here's what we want them to know, here's what the logo ought to be, here's what the theme is, and here are the colors. Oh, by the way, I don't like brown and yellow together. I think we ought to have gold and blue or something, you know. And I'm thinking to myself as I sit in these meetings, the logo, in the light of the conversation we're having about human sexuality, the color of the logo doesn't really resonate. So I'm saying that traditionally, how we go about communicating and how we understand that, particularly among some levels of leadership, that's the behavior. It isn't necessarily the professional discipline that you're talking about. But I do think that even at that, you will get consultants if you work with ad agencies. Some ad agencies will try to work with you on a traditional model of advertising that is no longer valid, because some of them, not all of them, some of them don't have the social media skills or the understanding about how to use social media strategically. And so we've had a lot of winnowing out of consultants that we work with in advertising based on that sort of model as well.
Hi, I'm Catherine Gold from American Baptist International Ministries Communications. And I'm speaking from my own Christian perspective right now. The United States is the third most unevangelized country in the world. But you'll see our immigration statistics are very high. We have many immigrants coming to the United States now. And our churches, I'm talking about American Baptist churches, I'm sure Lutheran Methodist and other denominations, are greater levels, and we're sending missionaries out.
Mhm.
And for us as RCC members to connect with those people would be very interesting and see what they have to say, looking from the outside in,
Right.
and how we are operating in the United States. I don't really know about the other faith traditions and movements as far as missionaries in the United States. But it's so interesting what's happening, and what you say is so true, that Christianity, for one, is really growing. And we do not appreciate that, because of course the United States is the center of the world, you know. And we just don't appreciate what's really happening in other parts of the world.
Yeah. Catherine, I have two responses. One is we are U.S. centric, and we in our organization work against that in almost on a daily basis because of the global realities that you're describing. Whatever my second thought was, it has just escaped me in response to your earlier statement. I'll come back to it if I think of it.
Yes.
I'm curious if you could share some reflections. I know a few years ago, your church, the Open Hearts, Open Mind, Open Door campaign, I thought was great. Some reflections on, obviously that wasn't done just from somebody up top saying this is a nice idea. There was a lot of research that went into
Yeah.
it. Sometimes the biggest challenge is, even though you said we're not horizontal anymore, because of that, I'm wondering, did the people on the ground that greet me when I walk in the open door, was that an obstacle? How did you overcome that? Sometimes our own people are kind of our worst enemies.
Yeah.
Was that an issue? How did you overcome that? And just some reflections on that whole campaign, because I from the outside, I don't know much about it, but it seemed to be a very well thought out strategic plan, horizontal, people friendly, all that. What did you learn from that you wish we wouldn't all do so you could have more results from it?
Well, yes, Steve Horswell Johnston is the first leader of that campaign. It was called Igniting Ministry. It actually had two fundamental components. One was an advertising presence to invite people. But the other was we put an equal amount of money and attention into training local church people so that our advertising was not false advertising. If you say you're open hearts, open minds, open doors, and you get to a local church and it doesn't display that, then you've done a bait and switch. And so we had to deal with that. And so we offered training around the church in hospitality and welcoming. We know, for example, that you consolidate your opinion about the church within 30 feet of the front door after you've come into contact with people, or within about 45 seconds after you've confronted folks. We know that if you ask a new person who's coming in, tell them you can't sit there because that's Mrs. Jones' seat and she sat in that pew for 30 years, that you're not likely to be perceived as welcoming and hospitable. We also helped our local churches to see that they needed to improve their signage so that folks who physically move about the building know where they are and that they are welcomed by folks at different places so they know. And we put a packet of training materials together. We held workshops with local churches and invited them and attempted to do as much as we could to do that kind of training so that when we did advertise and if people did come, that they would be received as we promised. The brand, it's interesting, we did not ask people to come to the United Methodist Church. If you'll think about that campaign, the brand for that campaign is the people of the United Methodist Church. It's not the United Methodist Church, because folks don't join institutions. Folks join other people. And the brand promise was, if you engage with the people of the United Methodist Church, we'll receive you with open hearts, open minds, open doors. So I appreciate your insight. It was a really fairly sophisticated communications strategy that we put together. It was not a public awareness strategy. It was a communication strategy designed to present the United Methodist Church in a favorable way two people who were seeking to engage in, and we knew who was likely to respond. Young families who were looking for guidance with their children, in rearing their children. People who wanted to be a part of a community that was broader than their local community, but who also wanted to participate with a community that sought to change the local community and to change the world. And people who were seeking a greater spiritual understanding about faith in life today. And those were the people who responded. I mean, we targeted them, and they were the ones who responded. Now, the other thing I'll say is that there were three groups that see these ads. When you're in broadcast, you're not, you're hitting everybody, but you're targeting particular audiences. There was our core audience. They were buoyed by the fact that we were present in the media. It was affirming to them that the church was present in that environment. And the key thing there is this: you have to meet people where they are in this environment. You can't pull them out of the environment and talk to them. You got to meet them where they are. And where do you all live today? How many of you, while I'm talking, are also receiving text messages or Twitter or email? You live in that environment, and you're comfortable there. And so if I'm going to communicate with you beyond just being here and physically in your face, it's going to be in that environment where you're present. So we communicated with those folks. We also communicated with people who had had an experience with United Methodist Church, but who had had a bad experience with the church and were turned off and were, in effect, disenfranchised or alienated. And then we communicated with a third group. So if you have this core circle here, you have a second circle here, and you have a third circle here, those were folks that we thought were seekers who did not know the church and who might benefit from simply the ad knowing the church. Guess where we got the most movement? It was in the middle group. It was the alienated folks who said, well, I had an experience with them once. It wasn't so good, but if they've changed, and they really are what they say now, I'll come back and I'll give them a test. And so we had more movement out of that middle group than we did out of the group at the far side. And of course, we were simply trying to reinforce the group at the center. Okay?
Thank you so much, Larry.
Thank you.
Appreciate it.